right, we have Nadine Strossen with us today. She was just reviewed today. She was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. That is why the show is so prescient. It makes me want to go look up the word prescient and find out what it means and what I'm talking about. No, she wrote this book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with free speech, not censorship. She is not particularly a conservative, but she is a true friend of free speech, which makes her a true friend of the show. And it's a really good interview. She's really sharp. All right. We have Nadine Strossen coming up. Nadine Strossen is the author of the recently published book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Nadine was the president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008. I didn't get a chance to ask her what has happened to the ACLU since then, but she really has a lot to say on free speech, and it is a terrific interview, so please listen in. Nadine, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to be here.
Well, this is, I'm really happy. I mean, I'm happy just to see a book with the title, Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with Free Speech, Not Censorship. I'm all for resisting hate, and I'm all for free speech, especially. Let's talk about, I mean, one of the things that I really like about the book is how clearly it's written and how you bring so many issues into focus. So let's try and do that here. I mean, let's begin with the fact, is there, in fact, a legal definition of hate speech? Is that something that exists in law?
Thank you so much for the compliment. And as you well know, but I will now enlighten your listeners, your viewers, there is no such legal concept, even though we hear the word flung about profligately in the public sphere by politicians, even by lawyers who should know better. And basically, as you know, Drew, precisely because there is no legal definition, people use it as an epithet to denounce whatever speech they hate or find hateful. And that covers a very wide spectrum indeed.
So is there any speech that, in fact, the courts have restricted on the basis of hatefulness?
Absolutely not, with one caveat. I think the caveat is very small, but to be precise, the mere fact that speech's message or viewpoint is hateful is never enough to justify censorship. And I think that's the point that you're stressing. We lawyers call that bedrock principle of the First Amendment. That's what the Supreme Court has called it, viewpoint neutrality, that government, others who wield power, must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, idea, message, or content of speech, no matter how much we may loathe it and fear it and believe it to be possibly dangerous. That is never a justification for censoring it. Now, here's the caveat, Drew, and that is that even though hateful speech may never be punished because of its message, it, along with speech that conveys any other message, may be punished in particular contexts if in the particular facts and circumstances, the speech directly causes certain imminent, serious harm, which can't be averted in any way other than punishing the speech. A good example would be a true threat, which is targeted at somebody, means to instill a fear that the person is going to be subject to a violent attack, which is likely to happen. Another good example is intentional incitement of imminent violence, which is also likely to occur imminently.
Okay. And what about if I'm in a situation where I'm actually in a fight already and I then utter hate speech, you know, maybe a racial slur while in that fight? Does that make the crime worse, or is that...
Excellent question. I know what you're getting at. And the particular facts you throw out might not satisfy the definition, and this is a legal concept, of a so-called hate crime or bias crime. If you take something that's already a crime, and the example that you're using is an assault, presumably, although maybe it was self-defense, I'd need to have more facts, but assume it were an assault. If the government could show that the crime victim was singled out for a discriminatory reason, such as race, religion, and so forth, then it could be treated as a more serious crime, warranting a more serious offense. But we have to be very careful that just because a racial epithet is uttered in the course of a fight should not automatically elevate it to a hate crime.
Okay, great. So now I want to talk about some of the threats to free speech. But before I get to that, I, I am under the impression that we are living in an actual golden age of free speech, that this court for a long time has been very, to use the now popular word, has been very robust in defending free speech. Is that a fair assessment?
That's really true that the United States Supreme Court, for all of its division on so many constitutional law and civil liberties issues, and despite its extremely broad ideological diversity from Sotomayor and Ginsburg on the left to Alito and Gorsuch on the right, they are almost unanimous on all of the important Supreme Court cases on free speech, and particularly on hate speech. If I may give you and your audience a very recent example, Drew, which I think they'll find interesting. One of the court's most recent decisions, which was issued at the end of its last term in June, unanimously struck down a federal hate speech law that was contained in the trademark and trade name sections of the federal statutes. Specifically, that law barred granting a federal trade name or trademark protection to a term that government inspectors deemed to be disparaging or demeaning on the basis of race, ethnicity. So you remembering the case, it was called Mattal versus Tam. It involved Simon Tam, an Asian American rock musician who had a band consisting of other Asian American male rock musicians, and they named their band the Slants. Obviously, that's traditionally a derogatory term for Asian people of Asian descent. Obviously, that was not the reason why Simon Tam and his bandmates chose the name. Rather, they were seeking the opposite message, declaring their pride in their ethnicity, seeking to reclaim the term, as many LGBT rights activists have reclaimed formerly disparaging terms, and in some contexts still disparaging. It depends who says it, right? Such as queer and dyke. And so what was interesting when the Supreme Court 9-0 struck down that law, they were respecting and enforcing not only robust freedom of speech, but also robust equality rights, that Simon Tam should have an equal right to express his pride in his ethnic heritage, regardless of some government official's decision. Well, the majority of the public might view it the wrong way as disparaging.
So the book is called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. I've traveled to universities. There are many college kids, and I presume they're professors, who feel that hate speech should be shouted down or barred. What does it mean when you say we should resist it with free speech, not censorship? How do you resist it with free speech?
And I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to stress that message, because the only verb in the title of my book is resist. I agree that we have much too much hateful attitudes and discriminatory action, and those of us who are deeply committed to human rights have a responsibility to do what we can and advocate that our government does what it can to check those problems. Interestingly enough, experience in this country and around the world shows that non-censorial alternatives are far more effective. First of all, something that we in the United States may take for granted, but we should not, because many other countries that are comparable in other ways do not sufficiently have or enforce anti-discrimination laws that make it illegal to actually discriminate in matters such as employment, education, housing, voting, and so forth. So let's start with the fact that if somebody is actually engaging in discrimination, that is illegal and perhaps even criminal, and has to be, those anti-discrimination laws have to be enforced. We also talked about another important example, Drew, and that is when somebody is targeted for a violent crime, or for that matter, a property crime, such as vandalism of certain religious institutions, that has to be treated very seriously and prosecuted. In a number of countries that vigorously enforce laws against hate speech, they're not so effectively enforcing laws against racist violence. And if I may use a historic example that will resonate with many people, certainly with me as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor who, almost died at the forced labor camp in Buchenwald, Germany, the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany, many people wrongly assume that, oh, if only there had been an anti-hate speech law, that would never have happened. The Holocaust could have been prevented. Not true. The Weimar Republic, during which Hitler and the Nazis rose to power, had very strict hate speech laws, very comparable to the laws that Germany still strictly enforces. And those laws were repeatedly enforced, including against Nazis. And in fact, the leading Jewish organization in Germany at the time said the laws are by and large being fairly enforced. It's not as if there are, weak prosecutions. And the Nazis loved it, by the way. This is one of the reasons why censorship is not only ineffective, but may even be counterproductive. Like a lot of hate mongers in this country, they welcomed the attention and the martyrdom and the sympathy that they gained from the prosecutions. And the failure was to protect against actual violence, because the Nazis got away with actual murder, literally. Physical assaults and outright assassinations of their political opponents and critics and Jews and other minorities. Beyond that, we should raise our voices in various ways to counter hateful messages, and that includes proactively educating our society, starting at very young ages, in values of tolerance and mutual respect and decency and equal human rights. It includes giving support to people and groups who are disparaged by hateful speech, so that they know that the hate mongers are only a small minority in this society. It includes refuting and rebutting arguments against the inequality of certain people, advocacy of legislation that will protect their rights against discrimination, counter protests, organizing. Basically, these are the tools that we have used in this country. I would be the last person to say we've arrived at liberty and justice for all. I spend full time trying to inch us closer to those grand goals. But I would have to admit, at a fairly mature age, that we are much, much, much closer to those goals than when I was born in 1950. And we're closer only because of the exercise of non-censorial counter-speech, anti-discrimination, and all the other positive measures that I've laid out.
That's, it's so true. I mean, political correctness itself, which I know is not a legal instrument, but it makes hateful speech funny. It makes it naughty. It makes it seem rebellious. And it just does the exact opposite of what it's supposed to do. Everything you shut down comes back more powerfully. What do you see now today as the biggest threat to free speech?
I think that the biggest threat to free speech today is what it has always been, and that is lack of public understanding of free speech and therefore lack of support for it, which is why I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to try to put out some information. I am very enthusiastic about all of the campus activism that we've been seeing in the past few years in support of human rights. And I like to see the glass half full as an activist. I always do that. And even though I'm distressed by statistics and surveys that indicate that a substantial majority of college students, as you indicated, Drew, would support censoring hateful speech, I know that that comes from a very positive, very commendable motive on their part, namely very strong support for and respect for the equality and dignity of their fellow students, members of minority groups, and real compassion to protect them from the slings and arrows of hateful words. But I don't want to single out today's college students, because throughout my entire adult lifetime, every survey of every group in our population has always showed a distressing lack of knowledge of even what the First Amendment is. And when people hear what it is, they usually say, oh, we should get rid of that. Sounds dangerous. In all seriousness, I think the best way to sum up a very prevalent attitude was in the title of a book by a wonderful writer who died a few years ago, Nat Hentoff, and it was called Freedom of Speech for Me, but Not for Thee, How the Left and Right Relentlessly Censor Each Other.
It's true. Now, I mean, maybe this is my own bias. I'm perfectly willing to admit it. I'm a conservative, but it does seem to me, for instance, when I look online and I see Mark Zuckerberg posting who's going to be labeled hate speech on Facebook. I see Twitter shadow banning conservative voices. I see Google dropping. It becomes very hard to find conservative sources on Google. I mean, do you see that as a threat? That kind of when social media has become so big, so monopolistic, do you see that as a threat to speech, or is it that them exercising their free speech?
Oh, excellent. Very tough questions, because as a literal matter, they are, in fact, as a private sector entity, and I suppose you as a conservative would very much applaud that fact, and I certainly do too, as a civil libertarian, that the private sector individuals and companies that are engaged in the communications field have their own First Amendment free speech rights, and those include making editorial type decisions about what messages will be conveyed and which will not be conveyed. On the other hand, if you look at the actual real world power that some of these companies have, and you used the word monopoly, we have antitrust laws to make sure that those in the private sector do not wield monopoly power that for all practical purposes would be at least as suppressive as government. And I say at least as, because by all accounts, Facebook is engaging in more censorship every week than all governments throughout history around the world have been able to engage in. Last time I saw a statistic, and it was about half a year ago, so I'm sure the numbers have escalated, Facebook said that it was taking down almost 300,000 hateful messages per month. And that gets to the second part of your very astute and challenging question, Drew, and that is it a problem in terms of, are they slanted towards taking down conservative messages rather than other messages? Well, first and foremost, they can exercise their power any way they choose. If they chose to rampantly censor Democrats, Republicans, African Americans, women, gay people, you name it, they would have a wide opportunity to do that. Now, there might be some anti-discrimination laws that might kick in, but certainly not on the basis of ideology. Secondly, however, those who have studied these patterns and complained about it have complaints all across the political spectrum. There is a group of almost 80 civil rights and civil liberties organizations that for years now have been complaining to Facebook that it disproportionately takes down as allegedly hateful speech, speech that's engaged in by Black Lives Matter activists, people who are protesting against police abuse and other injustice in the criminal justice system, pipeline protesters. Some of these critics actually call it race book. That's how disturbed they are. So I think there are, wherever you fall on the political spectrum, you should be very wary of this enormous power, which so far is not being checked by any antitrust enforcement and cannot be and should not be checked by the First Amendment itself.
I have to stop you there. I am out of time, Nadine. Really interesting conversation. The book is Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Any friend of free speech is a friend of the show on the left or the right. It's really nice talking to you, and I appreciate it.
A delight to be here. Thank you so much, Drew.
Thank you.